All right, so hello everyone, and welcome back to our online version of Ethics in the Environment. Today we're going to be looking at and discussing an article by a group of psychologists, a team led by Bethany Ojalehto, and the title of the article is called Seeing Cooperation or Competition, Ecological Interactions and Cultural Perspectives. So the reason that I've assigned you guys a psychology article, why would I do that within the context of environmental ethics? Well, because the hypothesis that is being tested in this article is seeking to examine whether or not one's cultural background and belief system actually influences the way that those individuals perceive ecological interactions. More specifically, whether one's cultural background inclines one to perceive and interpret ecological interactions as being either competitive in an evolutionary Darwinian sense or cooperative in a sort of indigenous, relational, reciprocal sense. So we're going to start today by talking a little bit about those two kinds of background considerations that might influence the way that one sees the world. And then we're going to hop into an examination of the actual details of this empirical study conducted by Ojalehto and her team of psychologists. So, as a little bit of background, we haven't read any of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species yet, so I'm going to give you guys a brief overview of how environmental relationships have typically been construed within the framework of natural selection, more specifically. So, Charles Darwin, a biologist who is really the father of modern biology, especially in terms of evolutionary science, he articulated the theory of evolution, which made reference to the way that species have diversified via a process of natural selection, which involves environmental pressures that are placed upon members of a species, which certain mutations that a species develops allow them to cope better with those changing environmental pressures and conditions. So species evolve when mutations are beneficial in helping members of that species to adapt to external environmental pressures. And over the course of thousands, millions of years, right, the process of mutation yields a lot of different physical features which have been selected for in order to adapt to those external pressures. So, for example, within the context of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, more specifically the passage Struggle for Existence, Darwin argues that the world and its evolution is driven by scarcity and competition. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that natural selection is essentially a process of evolutionary competition between members of a species who are developing different phenotypic or physical traits that enable them to adapt to those changing external environmental conditions. And the members of a species that have the best traits are the ones who win the competition by effectively filling the niche or the role that that species has been sort of filling insofar as they do so most effectively. So here's a quote from Darwin, from that passage, Struggle for Existence, from On the Origin of Species, wherein he sort of articulates this ecological balance through the process of environmental battle theory. Quote, "Battle within battle must be ever recurring with varying success. And yet, in the long run, the forces are so nicely balanced that the face of nature remains uniform for long periods of time, though assuredly the merest trifle would often give the victory to one organic being over another." So life, according to Darwin, tends towards the preservation of the individual. And this is generally going to be inherited by its offspring. So an individual organism is successful if it adapts to changing environmental conditions in a way that enables it to successfully pass its genes along to the next generation. So this way of perceiving ecological relationships is distinctly competitive in nature, right? It conceives of there being a sort of biological process of competition between species, which is part and parcel of natural selection and is also fundamental to survival. To quote Ojalehto, the Darwinian tradition sees both individuals and species as competing to survive. These are considered negative competitive interactions, and they're considered to be the building blocks of ecosystems, right? They're negative in the sense that there cannot be a sort of mutual flourishing on this worldview between members of a species who are very similar, insofar as they're competing to fulfill the same role or niche within the overarching ecosystem. All right. But Ojalehto wants to point out, right, that contemporary biological analyses by environmental scientists, and more specifically, indigenous environmental scientists, who are not trained in the academy, but who have an array of ecological knowledge on the basis of the way that they live their day-to-day lives in terms of having a land-based way of life. Right, so if you're an individual who relies on, for example, the parcel of Amazonia or the Amazon rainforest in which you live in order to survive, because you're acquiring all of your resources directly from that parcel of Amazonia, not from Whole Foods or some other grocery store, then one inevitable offshoot of that sort of day-to-day interaction with, for example, a biodiverse system is going to yield a wealth of knowledge about biodiversity and about how plants grow, how plants cooperate, how animals survive, what kinds of interactions occur between different animal species, right? You're going to basically have a wealth of knowledge about the forest, about that piece of the Amazon. So as we saw when we looked briefly at Robin Wall Kimmerer's indigenous worldview that she articulates in Braiding Sweetgrass, we saw that there are indigenous traditional ecological ways of knowing or belief systems that are A, based on actual knowledge about the land that enable those populations to subsist, to survive, and to engage in what Kyle White called food sovereignty, or practices that enable indigenous populations to feed themselves and their communities over time, while simultaneously contributing to the flourishing of the interactions in the biodiverse species that dwell in that particular landscape. So traditional ecological knowledge systems that inherit, more specifically, that reciprocal ethical framework that see the land as giving to us a wealth of resources when we invest through loving behaviors, energy, time, and our own resources into that landscape in order to contribute to its flourishing. Those reciprocal traditional ecological worldviews and ways of knowing do not incorporate the Darwinian conception of ecological competition into their cultural inheritance and conceptual framework. Instead, they could be said to have a cooperative view of how ecological interactions between various species occur. The first question that I want you to address is very basic. I want you to briefly define, utilizing quotes from the Ojalehto text, the difference between a cooperative framework or background set of beliefs and a competitive framework or background set of beliefs. How do these two worldviews differ with respect to how we interpret ecological relationships? So Again, you might want to use the text. You can also go back and listen to the first portion of this video again. And then once you do so, we'll come back together soon. So, contemporary investigations by both traditional ecological wisdom holders, like those who Kimmerer has learned from in her sort of evolution as both an environmental scientist and as a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Michigan, and knowledge gleaned from environmental scientists, has shown that some of our traditional worldviews are incorrect in terms of how we have traditionally conceived of ecological relationships. More specifically, traditionally it was thought that most predators, for example, coyotes and badgers, are in competition with each other insofar as they share the same prey source or source of food, and insofar as they fulfill the same kind of ecological niche or role in an ecological system, right? But contemporary investigations by, again, both traditional ecological wisdom holders and university environmental scientists have demonstrated that there are many ecological interactions that occur between predators of various species that end up being cooperative or teamwork oriented in nature. So it is demonstrable that at least some individual coyotes and some individual badgers team up in order to help each other maximize the yield that is given to them via their hunting practices. For example, they both target ground squirrels and other rodents and vermin of that nature as prey, the sort of entities that they consume for their nourishment. And ground squirrels burrow very extensive tunnels underground. So coyotes and badgers have figured out that if they utilize their unique skill sets together, they can yield a maximal benefit in terms of how many ground squirrels they can each acquire. So coyotes are very swift. Coyotes in this ecological interaction will typically stand outside of the den of the ground squirrel burrow on top of the earth, whereas a badger will sort of go a little bit into the tunnels from a more subterranean perspective because badgers know how to burrow, and they'll block the exit that the ground squirrel has sort of demarcated for itself in this region of the burrow network. And when you have a coyote at one end of the burrow network that is preventing your exit as a ground squirrel and a badger at the other end that is preventing your exit, well, you got nowhere to go, and eventually you're going to have to come out of that ground network in order to acquire food, water, etc., etc. So they have figured out that when they team up in this way, one of them will definitely capture a ground squirrel eventually, right? And if they continue to work together in this fashion over time, then they can ensure that there's a sharing of the resources that are yielded by this predatory framework, such that they both receive a lot of benefit. It maximizes their opportunities to acquire sustenance via the ground squirrels that they consume. So cool and so fascinating, I think. So this kind of cooperation is called intra-guild predation. That means that there is a sort of cooperative or guild-like contract that forms between members of different species that basically allows them to work together in order to maximize their efficacy or effectiveness in terms of how much prey they're willing and able to acquire when they work together. Fascinating stuff. I think this is so cool. So we know that this actually happens. So pause the video, and I want you to rehash for me what intra-guild predation is and how it shows up in just a few sentences in the interactions that occur between coyotes and badgers, because this is the intra-guild cooperative framework that ojalehto is going to focus on in this article. One of the really fascinating things about this intra-guild cooperative process is that coyotes and badgers don't just engage in hunting behaviors together. They actually engage in a lot of intimacy cultivating behaviors that produce oxytocin, which is a trust-building hormone which helps to ensure that they maintain a sort of cooperative relationship over time. Oxytocin is the same hormone that gets released when a mother bonds with her child, or when lovers bond, or when friends bond over time via, for example, hugging each other. So here's a quote from the text. Interestingly, the association between coyotes and badgers also involves behaviors that are not directly related to hunting activities, including play, sustained nasal and body contact, and resting together. That's right, they cuddle in order to produce oxytocin, which elicits trust. I think that is so fascinating. All right, so let's rehash the quick distinction in worldview that Ojalehto discusses in order to draw a distinction between what they call indigenous epistemologies or ways of knowing on the one hand, and Western European epistemologies or ways of knowing on the other hand. So according to Medin, whom Ojalehto and her team relies upon, epistemological orientations in the context of indigenous worldviews see humans as part of nature in order to emphasize principles of interconnectedness. In other words, everything has a role to play, and they take the perspectives of non-humans into account, end quote. In other words, indigenous members of societies which are land-based in nature are more likely to attribute intelligence or sophisticated psychological capacities to non-human animals. By contrast, Ojalehto claims, quote, that Euro-Americans, or Americans who are descendants of European immigrants, tend to adopt a competitive orientation to interpersonal interaction and behavioral attribution as compared to other ethnicities and cultures, end quote. So there is a likelihood that individuals with this competition-oriented worldview are going to fail to attribute more complicated cognitive states like high degrees of intelligence to non-human animals, which would, for example, prevent an individual with this sort of competitive worldview from even thinking that it's possible for, I don't know, coyotes and badgers to, for example, choose to come into an intra-guild contract that involves the cultivation of trust that occurs and unfolds over time, right? So in order to test this hypothesis that the way that an individual is culturally situated actually affects how they perceive possibilities in ecological relationships, Ojalehto and her team set up a set of experimental parameters in order to figure out whether members of different societal contexts interpret a wordless textbook that has pictures of coyotes and badgers interacting in this sort of intra-guild predatory way to test how these individuals are going to narrate that storybook, right? So for a sort of broader contextual framework, what happens in this experiment is that subjects were shown, again, a set of pictures that have coyotes and badgers interacting in an intra-guild fashion by touching noses, for example. And the subjects were prompted by the experimental psychologists to tell them what was occurring in this photo, right? What's occurring when the coyote and the badger come together and touch noses? So I want you to pause the video again and to tell me, A, what two groups are being tested by Ojalehto and her team? In other words, Who are the subjects that constitute, on the one hand, an indigenous worldview, and on the other hand, a European descendant worldview, or a cooperative worldview and a competitive worldview? Who are they? And how did they interpret the pictures that they saw that included the coyote and the badger differently? So to wrap up, it turns out, right, that the worldview that one adopts actually changes the way that one interprets biological interactions. In other words, one's worldview influences the way that one interprets the world more generally. So this should give us some reason to pause, right, and to really contemplate what worldview we are adopting as individuals and how that worldview might flow out into the way that we conceive of both our situatedness within a broader environmental landscape and framework, and how we conceive of other animals that are more than human as either being, for example, intelligent, capable of cooperation, capable of communication across and between species, amongst many other things. So I think this tells us that really getting clear about the philosophical framework that we find compelling is the first step that we have to take as environmental ethicists in order for us to sort of do the deeper work of remediating or fixing or providing and articulating solutions to some of the mass environmental issues like biodiversity degradation and climate change that are facing us today. So the final question that I have for you on the article that we've read on cooperation and competition in ecological systems is really going to prompt you to do a bit of critical thinking and creative work. More specifically, I want you to answer the following question. Do you think that the empirical studies that Ojalehto articulates, conducts, and provides the results in relation to give us reason to adopt a cooperative worldview over a competitive worldview? Why or why not? So a broader way to think about this is by thinking about the role that psychology should or could potentially play in informing environmental ethics. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart, and it's one that I would love to talk with you more about in the future if you find this fascinating and compelling as well. Until then, however, take some time to stop and pause the video to answer that question. And I wanted to thank you guys for such a fantastic quarter. I genuinely enjoyed having the opportunity to explore such a beautiful history and complicated history of environmental ethics, both in the context of the US, Europe, India, and indigenous communities more broadly. I hope that you likewise found it illuminating, compelling, and inspiring, and I hope to continue to cultivate conversations with you as you evolve throughout your progress as undergraduate students at Santa Clara University. So stay safe, be healthy, breathe, and remember all is well, and you have the power to articulate and to voice your strong view that can help to shift the way that our world is currently developing itself. In other words, be the change that you wish to see. I believe that you have the power to do it. Bye. Take care.